we can recall that right there in that first meditation, right at the very beginning of Descartes' project, he makes this claim that dictates the foundational structure of his knowledge edifice. And that foundational structure will prove key both to his skeptical negative project in that first meditation and to his positive epistemically constructive project in the rest of the meditations. So for Descartes, all of his judgments about the external world are either judgments about the ideas of sensation, directly following from the ideas of sensation, or they are traceable back through some series of judgments to judgments about the ideas of sensation, so that his knowledge edifice, his set of judgments about the external world, ultimately all depend upon those judgments about the ideas of sensation. And the contemporary foundationalists will translate that basic claim or view about the structure of our knowledge edifice into their contemporary conceptual framework in psychology and formulate it into a rigorous argument in the form of the regress argument. So the foundationalists will be working with this idea that knowledge is justified through belief, and therefore that they need to come up with an account of how it is that beliefs become justified. Then they'll assume that there is a positive answer to that. They won't start with a skeptical project like Descartes does. They'll assume that we are justified in believing things, and hence when we are justified in believing things that are true, we in fact do have knowledge. And so we'll start here with that first premise and say, look, suppose you justifiably believe something. Say you justifiably believe that all crows are black. Either your belief that all crows are black becomes justified by reference to another, or maybe many other, justified beliefs. Say, justificational transfer via inference from past observational beliefs. So you've observed a lot of black crows, and you make a universal generalization based on your particular observations. And since those particular observations are justified, the universal generalization then gains the justification that it has from the justification of those original individual observation beliefs. So either your belief becomes justified through that justificational transfer via inference, or it's self-justified or intrinsically justified, or it's a belief whose justification originates somehow within itself. Now, when we look at this particular belief, say, the belief that all crows are black, it doesn't look like a very good candidate at all for something that's self-justified or intrinsically justified. If we exercise Descartes' criterion, for example, it's easy to imagine that crows don't have to be black. Right? So if our belief isn't self-justified, it's not intrinsically justified, it's not a basic belief, then it must become justified through that former, that other mechanism of justificational transfer via inference from other beliefs that have justification. If that belief that all crows are black becomes justified via or through justificational transfer via inference from other beliefs, then those beliefs have to have justification in order to transfer it to our all crows are black belief. So how did they get their justification? How did they become justified? Well, that dichotomy still holds. Those beliefs are either justified by reference to other beliefs through that mechanism of justificational transfer via inference from those beliefs, or they are self-justified. And we'll see that at every point that dichotomy comes into play. And so if we suppose that there are no basic self-justified, intrinsically justified beliefs, if we suppose that each of these beliefs is justified by transference of justification from a previous belief, then we have this never-ending series of questions that ultimately postpone and don't provide us with an answer for how it is that this belief became justified. And so we see that sequence of the first to the fourth lines in our argument, they create this dichotomy so that for any justified belief, either we suppose that belief somehow gets its justification intrinsically, it's a basic belief, or that justification is conferred or transferred from other beliefs from which it can be inferred. So there's this inferential transference of justification from beliefs that previously already had that justification. On this latter hypothesis, though, we realize that this chain of justification transfer is going to, unwind or unfold in one of the four following ways. Either that justificatory transfer chain is circular, so that eventually the appeal to beliefs and the inference that we use to transfer justification from a previous belief to the next belief, as we move backwards and backwards, what we'll do eventually is we'll start to circle around until we cite the same belief at 2 points in our chain. Maybe the chain ends at that point, so that our justification chain, say the fourth belief, it gets justified by reference to a fifth and a sixth, and then the sixth gets justified by reference to the fourth again. Another way that this chain could unfold is that it never ends, that it goes on infinitely, so that every belief that we examine, it gets its justification via inferential transfer from a previous belief. And that belief gets its justification via inferential transfer, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. Third possibility, the chain ends, but it ends in a belief that doesn't have justification. If that's the case, then there is no original justification that can be transferred through those inferential steps, and so none of the beliefs are justified. And finally, we have the possibility that the chain terminates, and it terminates in a belief that doesn't need to get its justification through that inferential transfer or through reference to other beliefs. Instead, it is self-justified or intrinsically justified, i.e. it's a basic belief. The foundationalist will then go on to point out that the only option consistent with the supposition that your belief that all crows are black is justified is going to be that fourth option, P4. So that circular regressive justification, where I eventually circle back and appeal to a previous belief in the chain to justify a later belief in the chain, that's not consistent with being justified, and hence with your knowing anything, because it's consistent with the possibility that that circle of beliefs is coherent, and you can infer one from the other, but false. There's nothing in the circle that introduces justification, and hence there's nothing that facilitates its transfer through inference. What about that second option? The infinite regress. Well, in general, foundationalists will dismiss this. They'll say, look, it's psychologically false, but it also provides one with no unqualified justification. That is, every step that I go backwards in the justificatory chain, it only tells me how that first belief got justified when I make an appeal to the next step in that chain, and so on, and so on, and so on, so that it's not clear how it is the justification originated and hence can be transferred forward through this chain. The third option, where we have termination of the chain ends in a belief, but the belief is non-basic, that is, it isn't justified itself, well, that precludes it from transferring its justification through inference to the other beliefs and ultimately to the belief that I thought was justified in the beginning, that all crows are black. And so option 4, that chain that results in my believing that all crows are black, it transfers justification down, down, down until I get to a series of beliefs that are basic, that is, that don't need to be justified through this inferential transference. They have their own intrinsic justification, and hence justification is introduced into that chain so that it can propagate up through that inferential transformation or transference and ultimately justify the final belief in the series.